Ethan Wright was 7 when his mother left. It wasn't the kind of departure that came with explanations or goodbyes. She simply vanished, leaving behind a vacuum of unanswered questions and a broken family. He could still remember the sound of the front door creaking open late at night, and how her footsteps faded into the darkness, swallowed by the world outside. His father never talked about it. In fact, he barely talked at all after she left, burying himself in work, as if the pain could be hidden beneath stacks of reports and endless conference calls. Ethan learned early on how to fend for himself, growing up in a house that felt more like an empty shell than a home. His father, a once brilliant but now emotionally distant man, drifted through the years like a ghost. While other kids played outside or celebrated birthdays, Ethan's life became a blur of silence and missed moments. He turned to books, technology, anything that would take his mind off the hollow ache in his chest. By the time he reached adulthood, Ethan had transformed that hollow into drive. His intellect and obsession with technology propelled him through college and into the world of startups, where his relentless ambition paid off. Within a decade, he became a billionaire, a legend in Silicon Valley. But with each success, the emptiness only grew. Wealth and power couldn't fill the void his mother had left. The mystery of her disappearance haunted him, even when he tried to push it away. The world saw him as a genius, a man who had everything. But beneath that carefully crafted facade, Ethan was still that boy waiting for answers. He hated her. At least, that's what he told himself. Yet, no matter how much he tried to bury the pain, her absence lingered in every aspect of his life, especially in his relationships. Trusting someone, letting them get close, felt like inviting disaster. If his own mother could leave him, then anyone could. Then Lily appeared. It was a chance encounter, one of those moments that shouldn't have mattered, but it did. Lily Moore, with her wild curls and paint-stained fingers, walked into his life like a burst of color on a blank canvas. She was everything he wasn't: free-spirited, passionate, unburdened by the scars of the past. At first, Ethan didn't understand why he was drawn to her. Maybe it was her art, her ability to see beauty in chaos. Or maybe it was because she didn't look at him like the billionaire everyone else did. She saw him, just him. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something shift inside him. He began to believe that perhaps life could be more than just a series of cold transactions and calculated moves. Lily brought warmth into his world, something he hadn't realized he was missing until she was there. Ethan had never been one to believe in fate, but the moment he met Lily Moore, something changed. It wasn't a grand, dramatic entrance. There were no fireworks or sweeping music. It was just a quiet Saturday at a gallery in the city, the kind of place Ethan rarely visited. He was there for a charity event, one of those obligatory functions that filled his calendar. He had been standing near a series of abstract paintings, only half paying attention when he heard her laugh. Soft but full of life, the sound caught his attention, pulling his gaze toward her. Lily was across the room, talking animatedly with a group of people, her hands moving with the grace of someone used to creating beauty. She didn't notice him at first, but as the night wore on, they crossed paths near a painting, a vibrant, chaotic swirl of colors that seemed to leap off the canvas. "Do you like it?" she asked, her voice laced with curiosity as she caught him staring at the piece. Ethan blinked, caught off guard. "It's interesting," he replied, not sure what else to say. He wasn't used to small talk, especially not with strangers. She smiled, her eyes bright with amusement. "That's code for I have no idea what I'm looking at, isn't it?" He chuckled, surprised by her bluntness. "Something like that. Art's never really been my thing." She hummed, tilting her head to look at him more closely. "Maybe you've just never seen the right kind of art." There was something about the way she said it, as if she knew something he didn't. It intrigued him. Before he knew it, they were talking about more than just paintings. She told him about her passion for creating, how art had saved her during the hardest times in her life. Ethan found himself opening up in ways he hadn't expected. He told her about his company, his relentless drive, the pressures of being in his position, but he didn't tell her about his mother. That part of him was still locked away, buried too deep to bring up with someone he'd just met. The conversation flowed effortlessly, and by the end of the night, he found himself wanting to know more about her. Everything about her. She was different from anyone he had ever met. While everyone else in his world seemed to want something from him, partnerships, investments, influence, Lily seemed to want nothing. She was just herself, free and unfiltered. Days turned into weeks, and soon, they were spending more and more time together. Lily showed him her studio, a cluttered but cozy space filled with half-finished canvases and the smell of oil paint. Ethan, who was used to sleek offices and spotless boardrooms, found it oddly comforting. Here, in her world, there were no deadlines, no deals to close, just color and creativity. Lily made him laugh in a way he hadn't laughed in years. She challenged him, questioned his choices, but never judged him. She made him feel alive, as if the weight he carried for so long was slowly lifting. For the first time, Ethan could see a future that wasn't defined by success or revenge. It was filled with possibility. With her, he was falling for her. Hard. But even as he allowed himself to get closer, a small part of him remained guarded. There was something in Lily's eyes sometimes, a flicker of pain that she hid behind her smiles. Ethan knew that look all too well. He had perfected it himself. He wanted to ask her about it, to know what ghosts from her past haunted her. But he didn't press. He figured in time, she would tell him. After all, hadn't they both built walls around their hearts? Yet, despite the warmth she brought into his life, there were moments when the old wounds resurfaced. Late at night, when the house was quiet and the darkness settled in, his thoughts would drift back to his mother. The unanswered questions still gnawed at him, no matter how much he tried to ignore them. How could he ever fully trust someone when the one person who should have loved him unconditionally had abandoned him? And now, with Lily in his life, the fear of losing someone again, of being left behind, was even stronger. But Lily was different, he reminded himself. She wasn't his mother. She wouldn't leave. At least, that's what he told himself, until the phone call came. It was late one evening, not long after they had spent a perfect day together at the coast. Ethan was in his office, going through emails, when his phone rang. The number was blocked. He hesitated for a moment before answering, and when he did, the voice on the other end sent a chill down his spine. "I have information about your mother." The line went dead. Ethan froze, his heart racing. He stared at the phone, the weight of the words sinking in. How was that possible? His mother had been gone for over 20 years. There had been no trace of her, no signs of life. And now, out of nowhere, someone had information? His mind raced, 1,000 questions flooding in. Who was the caller? What did they know? And, most importantly, why now? As he tried to process the call, another thought crept into his mind, one that made his stomach twist with unease. Was it possible? Could Lily know something about this? Could she be connected to his mother in some way? The thought was absurd. Lily had never mentioned anything remotely related to his past. But the timing, how could it just be a coincidence? Doubt began to fester, creeping in like a shadow. Everything he had with Lily suddenly felt fragile, like it could all come crashing down with one wrong move. He didn't want to believe it, but the seed had been planted, and now he had no choice but to find out the truth. Ethan sat frozen, the phone still clenched in his hand as the last words of the mysterious caller echoed in his mind. "I have information about your mother." It didn't make sense. After years of silence, of endless searching and coming up empty, how could someone suddenly have answers now? His first instinct was disbelief, followed by anger. Was this some kind of cruel joke? Or worse, a trap? He set the phone down and paced the room, his thoughts swirling like a storm. He had worked so hard to bury the pain of his mother's abandonment, to keep that part of his life hidden even from himself. And now, out of nowhere, it was being ripped open again. Worse yet, the suspicion creeping into his mind. Could Lily somehow be involved? Was eating away at him. He hated that the thought had even crossed his mind. Lily was the one thing in his life that felt pure, uncomplicated. She didn't know about his past, about his mother, about the emptiness that had shaped him. How could she? He'd never shared those details with her. Still, something about the timing of the call nagged at him. He couldn't ignore it. That night, as they lay in bed, Lily slept peacefully beside him, her arm draped lightly over his chest. Ethan stared up at the ceiling, his mind racing. He wanted to reach out and touch her, to let the warmth of her presence ground him, but the doubts kept his hand frozen in place. He felt like he was standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down into a dark abyss, unsure whether to jump or retreat. The next morning, over breakfast, he tried to act normal, keeping the turmoil inside him tightly contained. Lily was her usual vibrant self, talking about an upcoming art exhibition she was excited about, her eyes sparkling with passion as she described the colors and themes she wanted to explore. Ethan smiled and nodded, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying the voice from the night before over and over again. "Ethan, are you listening?" she asked, her voice pulling him back to the present. He blinked, forcing a smile. "Sorry, yeah, I was just thinking about something." Lily tilted her head, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You've been distant since last night. Did something happen?" There it was, the moment he had been dreading. The chance to tell her about the call, about his mother, about everything that had been clawing at him since he was a child. But as he looked into her eyes, he hesitated. What would she think of him if she knew the truth? That the brilliant, composed man she fell for was still haunted by a woman who had abandoned him decades ago? "It's nothing," he finally said, the lie slipping from his lips too easily. "Just work stuff." Lily studied him for a moment longer, her expression softening as she reached across the table to squeeze his hand. "You know you can talk to me, right? About anything?" Ethan nodded, guilt gnawing at him as he squeezed her hand back. "I know," he said, though the words felt hollow. He wasn't ready to tell her. Not yet. After Lily left for her studio, Ethan's thoughts immediately returned to the phone call. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was something he had to deal with on his own, without involving her, at least until he knew more. He grabbed his phone and began searching for answers. He called the number back, but it was blocked. No surprise there. Frustration simmered in his chest. Whoever had called knew exactly how to get to him, how to exploit his deepest wound, and now they were in control. Ethan wasn't the type to sit back and wait. He was a man of action, someone who built an empire by chasing down every opportunity and eliminating every threat. This would be no different. If there was information about his mother out there, he would find it. And if Lily was somehow connected, if she knew more than she was letting on, well, he would deal with that too. But the more he thought about it, the more absurd it seemed. Lily? Involved with his mother? It didn't add up. He needed to keep his head straight, not let paranoia get the better of him. Yet, the doubt was there, a tiny crack in the trust he'd started to build with her. As the days passed, Ethan's obsession with the phone call deepened. He tried to stay present with Lily, to maintain the illusion that everything was fine. But the more he dug into his mother's past, the more questions arose. He called in favors, reached out to old contacts, and scoured every database he had access to. Nothing. It was as if his mother had disappeared off the face of the earth. Then, a week later, he got another call. This time, it wasn't blocked. The number was local, from a small town in California, Santa Clarita, a place Ethan had never heard of. He answered immediately. "Come to Santa Clarita," the voice on the other end said, cold and direct. "I have what you're looking for." Before Ethan could respond, the line went dead again. Santa Clarita. The name echoed in his mind. What was his mother doing there? How long had she been hiding? And why, after all these years, was someone reaching out now? He sat back in his chair, his mind spinning. This wasn't just a random town. It was the place where Lily had told him she spent her summers, working at a local art center. Coincidence? Or something more? Ethan's stomach tightened. He could no longer ignore the possibility, however small, that Lily was somehow involved. There were too many connections, too many unanswered questions. He needed to get to the truth, and there was only one way to do that. That night, Ethan made a decision. He would go to Santa Clarita, but not as himself. If someone was playing games with him, he needed the element of surprise. He would find out what was really going on in that town, and why Lily had never mentioned it before. The only way to get the answers he needed was to stay hidden, to watch from the shadows. And so, Ethan Wright, the billionaire tech mogul, would become someone else entirely, a gardener, working quietly in the background, unnoticed, waiting for the truth to reveal itself. The small town of Santa Clarita sat nestled between rolling hills and a rugged coastline, a place that felt worlds away from Ethan's life in the tech-driven chaos of San Francisco. He had expected it to be quiet, and it was too quiet, almost suffocating in its stillness. Here, there were no glass skyscrapers, no buzzing phones or conference calls, just the sound of the ocean in the distance and the steady rhythm of daily life in a town that seemed to be untouched by time. Ethan had arrived under the cover of anonymity, using a false name and a carefully constructed backstory. Disguised as a simple gardener, he blended into the background, just as he'd planned. His once meticulously groomed appearance was now replaced by sun-worn clothes and dirt under his fingernails. For a man used to power and control, there was something strangely liberating about being invisible. But it also unnerved him. He was here for answers, and that meant staying focused. The art center where Lily spent her summers was a modest building tucked away in the heart of Santa Clarita. It was a hub of creativity and community, a stark contrast to the sleek, tech-infused world Ethan had built. Every morning, he would arrive early, his tools in hand, and spend hours working in the garden just outside the studio where Lily painted. It was the perfect vantage point, allowing him to observe her without drawing attention. At first, it felt strange, watching her like that. He had always been upfront with her, well, mostly. But now there was a growing divide, a rift of secrets between them. She didn't know he was here, didn't know about the phone calls or the questions gnawing at him. She believed he was back in the city, swamped with meetings and business. Every time his phone buzzed with one of her messages, he felt a pang of guilt. But he couldn't stop now, not when he was so close to uncovering the truth. Lily moved through the studio with an ease that made Ethan ache. She was completely in her element here, surrounded by canvases and paint. She laughed easily with the other artists, her eyes bright with joy. From the outside, it was easy to see why he had fallen for her. But the question that haunted him now was how much of what he knew about her was real and how much she was hiding. As the days passed, Ethan kept his distance, careful not to reveal his presence. He spent his time quietly tending to the garden, pulling weeds, trimming hedges, and watching. But it wasn't just Lily he was keeping an eye on. He was waiting for another sign, for the shadowy figure from the phone calls to make themselves known. Whoever it was, they hadn't reached out again since he arrived in Santa Clarita, and the silence was unnerving. It was on a warm afternoon, about a week into his stay, that Ethan noticed something unusual. Lily had been in the middle of painting when she received a phone call. Her entire demeanor changed in an instant. The laughter disappeared, replaced by a tightness around her mouth, her free hand nervously twisting a brush. She spoke in hushed tones, too low for Ethan to hear, but her body language told him everything he needed to know. Whoever was on the other end of that call had shaken her. He watched as Lily ended the call abruptly, her hand trembling slightly as she placed the phone down. She stared at her canvas for a long moment before abruptly packing up her things and leaving the studio, her usual light step heavy with tension. Ethan's heart pounded. He waited a few minutes before following at a distance, keeping to the shadows as she made her way through the narrow streets of the town. Lily walked with purpose, her head down, her shoulders tense. Ethan trailed behind, careful to stay far enough back that she wouldn't notice. She led him to the outskirts of town, to a secluded area near the cliffs where the waves crashed violently against the rocks below. There, she met someone, an older woman, her hair streaked with gray, dressed in simple clothes. From where he stood, hidden behind a grove of trees, Ethan couldn't make out their conversation, but it was clear they were arguing. His stomach twisted as he watched the exchange. Was this the person who had called him? Was this woman connected to his mother? The way Lily gestured, the tension in her posture, it was like she was pleading, as if she were trying to protect something or someone. But who? And why? Ethan's mind raced. Everything he had feared was beginning to materialize. Lily was hiding something big. The realization hit him like a blow to the chest, stealing the breath from his lungs. He had wanted to believe in her, to trust her, but now the doubts were too loud to ignore. Whatever this was, it was connected to his mother. It had to be. The conversation ended abruptly. The older woman turned and walked away, disappearing down the rocky path, while Lily stood there for a moment longer, staring out at the sea. Her shoulders slumped, as if the weight of whatever secret she was carrying was too much to bear. Ethan wanted to run to her, to demand answers, but he knew he couldn't. Not yet. He needed more information. He needed to know exactly what was going on before he confronted her. As much as it pained him, he had to remain in the shadows a little longer. That night, as he lay in the small, bare room he had rented under his fake identity, Ethan replayed the scene over and over in his mind. Who was that woman? What was she to Lily? And, more importantly, what did she know about his mother? There was a knot of dread tightening in his gut, but alongside it was something else: anger. Anger at the lies, at the half-truths, at the idea that the one person he had allowed himself to care for could be deceiving him. But he wasn't a child anymore, waiting helplessly for someone to explain why they'd left him. This time, he would find the truth on his own terms. And when he did, there would be no more hiding. Not for Lily. Not for anyone. The next morning, Ethan resumed his role as the quiet gardener. But inside, the storm was brewing. Every glance, every interaction with Lily felt like a game of deception. She didn't know he was watching her so closely, but soon she would. Soon, they would both face the secrets that had been buried for far too long. The sun hung low over the horizon, casting long shadows across the town as Ethan pulled weeds from the garden outside the art center. His movements were methodical, his face calm, but inside, his mind raced with everything he had seen the day before. The image of Lily, standing near the cliffs with that mysterious woman, haunted him. The way she had looked, so tense, so secretive, was not the Lily he thought he knew. As he worked, he kept one eye on the art studio, watching for any sign of her. His cover as the quiet gardener had worked well so far, allowing him to observe without being noticed. But the deeper he dug into Lily's life, the more uneasy he became. She was hiding something, there was no doubt about that now. And whatever it was tearing her apart. That afternoon, Lily arrived at the studio as usual, but Ethan noticed something different about her. Her steps were slower, her shoulders slouched with a weight he hadn't seen before. She moved through the studio quietly, avoiding conversation with the other artists, her eyes downcast. Ethan felt a pang of sympathy for her, but it was quickly overtaken by suspicion. He couldn't let himself soften. Not now. Not when the truth was so close. By mid-afternoon, she packed up her brushes and left the studio earlier than usual, heading toward the path that led to the cliffs. Ethan followed at a distance, keeping to the trees, his heart pounding in his chest. This time, he couldn't wait in the shadows. He needed answers. Lily walked quickly, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as if bracing herself for something. Ethan watched as she reached the same secluded spot near the cliffs where she had met the older woman. He hung back, his pulse quickening as he waited for someone to appear. But this time, Lily was alone. She stood there for a long time, staring out at the waves crashing against the rocks below. From his hiding spot, Ethan could see the tension in her posture, the way her fingers gripped the edges of her sweater like she was holding on for dear life. Something was weighing heavily on her. Something that went beyond the carefree artist she presented to the world. Suddenly, she pulled her phone from her pocket and dialed a number. Ethan strained to hear, inching closer, keeping his body low behind the brush. Her voice, though quiet, carried in the stillness of the late afternoon air. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up," Lily said, her voice trembling. "He's going to find out. I'm sure of it." Ethan's blood ran cold. There was no mistaking it now. She was talking about him. "I don't care what you promised," she continued, her words clipped with frustration. "This is tearing me apart. He deserves to know the truth." The truth. The word hung in the air, thick with implication. Ethan's hands clenched into fists as he listened. He had suspected something for weeks, but hearing her say it out loud sent a surge of anger and betrayal coursing through him. She had been lying to him, keeping secrets that he had every right to know. The conversation ended abruptly, and Lily sank to the ground, her head in her hands. Ethan watched, torn between the impulse to confront her right then and there and the need to stay hidden a little longer. He needed more. He needed to know exactly what she was hiding before he made his move. He stayed silent, retreating further into the trees as Lily finally stood and made her way back to town, her steps heavy with the weight of her decision. Ethan didn't follow her this time. Instead, he waited until she was out of sight before making his way to the spot where she had stood. The cliffs loomed ominously above the crashing waves, the wind whipping through the tall grass around him. Ethan stood there, staring out at the ocean, his mind racing. What truth was Lily talking about? What was she hiding from him? And why was she so afraid of him finding out? The next morning, Ethan arrived at the art center early, his mind made up. He couldn't wait any longer. Whatever Lily was hiding, he had to uncover it now. His plan had been to remain invisible, to gather information without anyone noticing, but he couldn't stay in the shadows anymore. He needed answers, and there was only one way to get them. He waited for Lily to arrive, his heart pounding with anticipation. When she finally walked through the door, she smiled at the other artists, her usual light demeanor back in place as if nothing had changed. But Ethan could see the cracks beneath the surface. She was putting on a show, pretending everything was fine when it was anything but. As soon as she settled into her studio, Ethan moved. He crossed the garden in long strides, his mind focused and determined. When he reached the doorway of her studio, he paused for a moment, his breath shallow. This was it. He couldn't turn back now. He stepped inside, and Lily looked up, surprised to see him. "Ethan," she said, her eyes widening. "What are you doing here? I thought you were in the city." Ethan stared at her, his heart hammering in his chest. "I've been here for days, Lily. Watching. Waiting." Her face paled, the color draining from her cheeks. What do you mean?" "I saw you yesterday," he said, his voice tight with anger. "I heard you on the phone. I know you've been keeping something from me, and I want to know what it is. Now." Lily's mouth opened, but no words came out. She stood there, frozen, her eyes darting to the side as if searching for an escape. But there was nowhere to go. Not anymore. Ethan took a step closer, his eyes locked on hers. "Tell me the truth, Lily. Whatever it is, I need to hear it." For a moment, she said nothing, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and regret. Then, finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry, Ethan," she said, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I never wanted to hurt you, but I—" "What are you hiding?" he demanded, his voice sharp with frustration. "What are you keeping from me?" Lily hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. When she looked back up, her face was filled with pain. "It's your mother," she said quietly. "I've known where she is for a long time, and I'm so sorry." Ethan's world tilted. He felt the ground shift beneath him as the weight of her words sank in. His mother. She had known. All this time, she had known where his mother was, and she hadn't told him. His heart pounded in his ears as the realization hit him like a wave. "You knew," he whispered, his voice raw with betrayal. Lily nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't want to lose you." Ethan took a step back, his mind reeling. The woman he had trusted, the woman he had fallen for, had been lying to him from the very beginning. The truth he had been searching for was right in front of him, and it had been hidden by the one person he thought he could trust. Everything he had believed in was a lie. He turned and walked out of the studio, leaving Lily standing there, her tears falling silently to the floor. Ethan walked in a daze, his thoughts unraveling with each step. His chest felt tight, as if the weight of Lily's betrayal was physically crushing him. The woman he loved had been hiding the one thing that haunted him most. His mother. She had known all along. The anger surged again, hot and all-consuming, but beneath it, a deeper pain gnawed at him. How could Lily have kept this from him? How could she lie, day after day, while they built something he thought was real? He didn't stop walking until he found himself near the cliffs, the same place where he had seen Lily speaking with the mysterious woman. The sea rumbled below, its waves crashing against the rocks like an echo of the turmoil inside him. His thoughts swirled, and with them came the question that wouldn't leave his mind. Why? Why had Lily kept his mother's whereabouts a secret? Was she protecting someone? Or had she been trying to protect him? The thought gnawed at him, deepening the confusion. He knew he couldn't get answers from her now, not while the wound of her betrayal was still fresh. But there was someone else who could give him the truth. The woman who had disappeared from his life all those years ago. His mother. His phone buzzed in his pocket, startling him out of his thoughts. Without thinking, he pulled it out. Another message from Lily. Please don't shut me out. Let me explain. You don't know everything yet. He stared at the words, his jaw clenched. He wanted to throw the phone into the ocean, to rid himself of the lies and the hurt. But instead, he shoved it back into his pocket. There would be time to deal with Lily later. Right now, there was only one thing he needed: answers. That night, Ethan made his decision. He couldn't wait for more calls or cryptic messages. He had to confront his mother, face to face. If she was in Santa Clarita, if she had been living here all this time, he needed to know why she had abandoned him, why she had left him without a word or an explanation, and more importantly, why she had stayed hidden for so long. He didn't know where exactly she was, but he had a feeling Lily did. As much as it pained him to admit it, he needed her help. The next morning, he returned to the art center, his heart pounding with a mix of dread and anticipation. When he found her in the studio, Lily looked up, her eyes still swollen from the tears she had shed the night before. She opened her mouth to speak, but Ethan held up his hand, silencing her. "I don't want to hear excuses," he said, his voice tight with restraint. "Just tell me where she is." Lily blinked, her face crumpling with the weight of the moment. For a second, she looked like she might argue. But then she nodded, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "There's a small house near the edge of town," she said quietly, "down by the old lighthouse. That's where she's been staying." Ethan didn't wait for her to say anything else. He turned and left, his mind already racing toward what he would say to his mother, how he would confront the woman who had caused him so much pain. As he walked through the town, each step felt heavier than the last. He had dreamed of this moment for years, facing her, demanding answers. But now that it was happening, the enormity of it pressed down on him like a weight he wasn't sure he could bear. The path to the lighthouse was quiet, the only sound the distant hum of the ocean and the wind stirring the tall grass around him. The small house came into view, weathered and worn by the years, its windows dark and lifeless. Ethan stood at the edge of the property for a long moment, his heart hammering in his chest. This was it, the place where his mother had been living, hiding, all these years. With a deep breath, he approached the front door. His hand trembled as he raised it to knock, but before he could, the door creaked open, and there she was, his mother. She was older now, her once dark hair streaked with gray, her face lined with years of hardship and secrets, but there was no mistaking her. Ethan felt his breath catch in his throat, the sight of her triggering a flood of memories he had long buried. She stared at him, her eyes wide with shock, as if she couldn't believe he was standing there. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You found me." The air between them crackled with unspoken words, years of hurt and confusion hanging heavy in the silence. For a moment, Ethan couldn't move, couldn't speak. He had imagined this moment for so long, had pictured what he would say, how he would demand answers. But now that she was standing in front of him, the words refused to come. I didn't think you'd ever come," she said, stepping forward hesitantly. Her eyes were filled with something Ethan couldn't quite place. Was it regret, fear, or relief? His chest tightened with anger, the rage he had been holding back for so long finally breaking through. "You didn't think I'd come?" he repeated, his voice rising. "You disappeared without a word. You left me. You left us. And now I'm just supposed to, what? Forget it ever happened?" Tears welled in her eyes, but Ethan couldn't stop now. The dam had broken, and everything he had been holding back came spilling out. "Do you have any idea what that did to me? To Dad? You destroyed us. You destroyed me," he said, his voice raw. "And now, after all these years, you're here, living in some small town like none of it ever mattered. How could you do that? How could you just walk away?" His mother took a deep, shuddering breath, her hands trembling as she reached out toward him. "Ethan, don't," he snapped, pulling away from her. "Don't try to explain it away. I want the truth. I deserve that much." She stood there, silent for a long moment, her face crumpling with the weight of his words. Then, finally, she spoke, her voice trembling. "You're right," she said, her eyes locked on his. "You deserve the truth, but it's not what you think." Ethan stared at her, his heart pounding. "Then tell me," he demanded. "Tell me why you left." His mother hesitated, glancing past him as if she was searching for the right words. "It wasn't my choice," she said softly. "I didn't leave because I wanted to. I was forced to leave." Ethan blinked, his anger faltering for a moment. "Forced? What are you talking about?" She swallowed hard, her gaze finally meeting his. "There were things happening, things I couldn't control. I left because I had to protect you." "Protect me?" Ethan's voice cracked with disbelief. "From what? From who?" She took a step closer, her expression pained. "From people who would have hurt you. From the truth about our family that would have destroyed you." Ethan's heart raced, his mind spinning with confusion. What truth? For a long moment, his mother was silent, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "The truth about your father, and the truth about what really happened the night I left." Ethan felt the ground shift beneath him, the foundation of everything he thought he knew beginning to crack. This wasn't just about his mother's abandonment. There was something darker, something deeper at play. And now, standing here on the precipice of the truth, he wasn't sure he was ready to hear it. Ethan stood frozen, the weight of his mother's words hanging in the air between them like a storm about to break. His pulse raced as his mind struggled to process what she had just said. The truth about your father. He had never questioned his father, the man who had raised him after his mother left. The man who had been a distant figure, consumed by work, but still there, still present. To Ethan, his father had been the one constant, the one person who hadn't abandoned him. And now, his mother was saying it had all been a lie. "What do you mean, the truth about Dad?" Ethan's voice was sharp, cutting through the tension. "What are you talking about?" His mother's face softened with sorrow, her hands twisting nervously at her sides. "It's complicated," she said quietly, as if the very weight of her explanation could shatter them both. "I don't care how complicated it is. You owe me an explanation. I've spent my entire life wondering why you left. You don't get to stand here now and tell me it was to protect me without telling me from what." His voice cracked with anger, the years of resentment finally surfacing. She took a deep breath, her eyes filled with regret. "I didn't want you to find out like this, Ethan. But your father, he wasn't the man you thought he was." Ethan's jaw tightened. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, then finally spoke. "Your father was involved in something dangerous. His work in technology, what you know of his career, that was only part of it. There were people, powerful people, who wanted him to use his expertise for things far darker than what he was publicly known for." Ethan shook his head, disbelief tightening in his chest. "That doesn't make any sense. Dad was a businessman. He wasn't some criminal." "I know it's hard to believe," she said, stepping closer, her eyes pleading with him to listen. "But it's the truth. Your father got involved with the wrong people. They were using him, his genius, to create systems that could be weaponized, used for control, for manipulation. When he realized how deep he was in, he tried to back out, but by then, it was too late. They wouldn't let him leave." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. His father, cold, distant, but steady, wasn't who he had believed him to be. Why didn't he tell me? Why didn't he? He couldn't finish the sentence. His mind raced, his childhood flashing before his eyes. The long nights when his father was locked away in his office, the strained conversations, the way he seemed so detached. It had always felt like grief, but now, something darker lurked behind those memories. "He couldn't tell you," his mother continued, her voice breaking. "He was trying to protect you, the same way I was. The people he was involved with, once they knew he wanted out, they threatened us. They threatened you." That's why I had to leave, Ethan. I couldn't risk you getting hurt." Ethan stared at her, his hands shaking with the intensity of the emotions surging through him. "So you ran," he said, his voice hollow. "You left us. You left me. You let me believe it was your choice." Tears filled her eyes, and she reached out. But Ethan stepped back, the pain in his chest growing unbearable. "It wasn't my choice," she said, her voice trembling. "I wanted to take you with me, but they wouldn't let me. I thought if I disappeared, if I stayed hidden, they would leave you alone." Ethan's heart pounded in his ears. His whole life had been a lie. His mother hadn't abandoned him because she didn't care. She had done it to save him. And his father, the man he had always thought of as stoic and distant, had been living with secrets that went far beyond anything Ethan could have imagined. "Why didn't you come back?" he demanded, his voice thick with emotion. "When Dad died, why didn't you come for me then?" She wiped at her eyes, shaking her head. "I was still being watched, Ethan. Even after your father's death, they kept tabs on me. I couldn't risk drawing attention to you. It wasn't safe." Ethan turned away, running a hand through his hair as the enormity of it all settled in. Everything he had believed about his family, everything he had built his life around, it was all unraveling. The father he had idolized was entangled in something dark and dangerous, and the mother he had resented for abandoning him had been running for her life. "What do they want now?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Why are you still hiding?" She hesitated, glancing away before answering. "The people your father worked with, they haven't forgotten. Even after all these years, they're still looking for the technology he developed, and they know that you, as his son, could be a threat to them. They think you might have access to what he created, and that's why I've stayed hidden. If they knew we were connected, they'd come after you." The pieces started to click into place. The phone calls, the mysterious warnings. It wasn't just about his mother's disappearance. This was something far bigger, something that had been simmering beneath the surface of his life without him even realizing it. And Lily? The name slipped from his lips before he could stop it, the thought of her pulling him back into the present. How does she fit into all of this? His mother's expression softened with sympathy, but there was a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. "Lily was trying to protect you," she said gently. "She found out about me by accident years ago. When she realized who I was, she tried to keep her distance, but," she paused, searching for the right words. "She cares about you, Ethan. She didn't want to hurt you by keeping this secret, but she knew if you got too close to me, the people watching me would turn their attention to you." Ethan's stomach twisted with the conflicting emotions swirling inside him. Betrayal, anger, and something else he didn't want to admit, understanding. Lily had lied to him, but she had done it out of fear, out of a desperate attempt to keep him safe. His mother stepped closer, her voice soft but urgent. "You need to be careful now, Ethan. The people who were after your father, they don't care that it's been years. If they find out you're involved, they'll come for you, too. They'll stop at nothing to get what they want." Ethan looked at her, his mind spinning with the implications of everything she had just revealed. His father's shadow loomed large, even after his death. And now, Ethan was at the center of something he never wanted to be part of. But he couldn't run. "Not now. I won't hide," he said, his voice steady. "I won't let them control my life like they did to Dad." His mother's eyes filled with worry. "You don't understand how dangerous they are, Ethan. You can't fight them alone." "I'm not alone," he said, the determination settling in his chest. "I have people I can trust. I'm not going to let them win. Not this time." She looked at him, her face a mixture of fear and pride. "I just don't want to lose you too." "You won't," Ethan promised, though he wasn't entirely sure how he could keep that promise. But one thing was clear. He couldn't go back to his life as it was before. He had to confront this, face it head-on, and put an end to the shadows that had haunted his family for far too long. As Ethan walked away from the small house, his mind was already racing ahead. He needed to find Lily, to make sense of what role she had played in all of this. But most of all, he needed to find out exactly what his father had been involved in, and how deep the danger ran. The fight wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. Ethan walked away from his mother's house, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. The sun was sinking low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the quiet streets of Santa Clarita. But inside him, there was nothing but chaos. His mother's revelation had shattered the foundation of everything he had believed about his past, about his father, and about himself. He felt raw, exposed, like the ground had been pulled out from under him and he was free falling into uncertainty. But amidst the anger, the betrayal, and the confusion, one thought kept surfacing: Lily. He couldn't shake the image of her, how she had stood in front of him, eyes filled with regret, begging for him to understand. She had known the truth about his mother, about the danger he was in, and yet she had kept it from him. But why? To protect him? To protect herself? The lines between love and deception had blurred so completely that Ethan didn't know what to believe anymore. As he made his way back to town, his thoughts tangled in knots of doubt and fury. He knew he had to confront her. He couldn't move forward until he had the full truth from her lips. But even as the anger simmered inside him, there was something else, something deeper. The thought of losing her, of cutting her out of his life completely. He had fallen for her. That much he knew. He had let her in, allowed himself to feel something real for the first time in years. And now, that vulnerability was the very thing that could destroy him. By the time he reached the small cottage where Lily was staying, the sky had darkened, and the stars were beginning to appear. Ethan hesitated at the front door, his chest tight. He had no idea how this conversation would go, or if it would be the end of everything between them. Part of him didn't want to face her, to hear the truth that might push him further into the abyss. But he couldn't avoid it. He needed closure, one way or another. He knocked on the door, his heart pounding. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the door creaked open, and there she was. Lily stood in the doorway, her face pale and drawn, as if she had been waiting for this moment all day. Her eyes, once so bright and full of life, were shadowed with guilt and fear. She didn't say anything at first, just looked at him with a sadness that seemed to reach deep into his soul. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He stepped inside without a word, his gaze hard and searching. The room was dimly lit, the quiet hum of the ocean faint in the background. For a long moment, they stood there, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on them like a physical force. "I talked to my mother," Ethan said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "She told me everything." Lily swallowed, her eyes glistening. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I never wanted to hurt you. I thought I was protecting you." "Protecting me?" Ethan's voice rose, the anger he had been holding back now spilling over. "You kept the truth from me, Lily. You lied to me. How is that protecting me?" Lily flinched at the sharpness of his words, but she didn't look away. "I didn't want you to get hurt," she said, her voice trembling. "Your mother told me what happened to your father, about the people who are still watching her. I thought if you found out, if you got too close to her, they'd come after you, too. So you decided to keep me in the dark?" Ethan demanded, his heart pounding with frustration. "You thought lying to me was better than trusting me with the truth?" "I didn't want to lose you," she said, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I didn't know what else to do. I was scared, Ethan. I was scared of what would happen if you knew everything." Ethan's chest tightened. He wanted to stay angry, to let the hurt and betrayal drive a wedge between them that he could never cross. But the sight of her, standing there, vulnerable and broken, made it impossible. He could see the fear in her eyes, the fear of losing him, of having pushed him too far. And as much as he hated what she had done, part of him understood. They were both damaged, both carrying the weight of the past. Lily had been trying to protect him in the only way she knew how, just like his mother had tried to protect him by running. They had all made mistakes. But now, standing here in the aftermath, Ethan had to make a choice. He could let the betrayal consume him, let the anger push him further into isolation, or he could forgive. He could choose to believe that Lily had lied not out of malice, but out of love. He could let her back in, let them face whatever came next together. "I don't know if I can trust you," Ethan said finally, his voice raw. "I don't know if we can come back from this." Lily nodded, her face crumpling with emotion. I understand, she whispered. I'll do whatever it takes to make it right. I don't want to lose you, Ethan. I love you. I always have. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He had never heard her say it before. Those words that seemed to carry so much weight, so much meaning. I love you. They hung in the air between them, fragile and uncertain, waiting for him to either embrace them or break them. He took a step closer, his heart racing. Do you really mean that? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lily met his gaze, her eyes full of pain and desperation. Yes, she said, her voice steady. I love you, Ethan. I love you more than anything. And I'm so sorry for what I've done. I'll spend the rest of my life proving that to you, if you let me. Ethan stood there, the weight of her words sinking in. He could see the sincerity in her eyes, the regret etched into every line of her face. But more than that, he could feel it, the connection between them, the pull that had drawn them together in the first place. It was still there, beneath the hurt and the lies. It had never really gone away. Slowly, he reached out, his hand trembling as he brushed a strand of hair from her face. Lily closed her eyes, leaning into his touch, and for a moment, the world seemed to still. I don't know where we go from here, Ethan said softly, but I'm willing to try. I'm willing to figure it out if you are. Lily's eyes fluttered open, and a small, hopeful smile tugged at her lips. I am, she whispered. They stood there in the quiet of the room, the air thick with unspoken promises and tentative hope. It wasn't a perfect ending. It wasn't even close. But it was a beginning, an uncertain, fragile beginning that they would have to navigate together. As they held each other in the fading light, Ethan knew that the fight wasn't over. There were still shadows lurking in the past, dangers that had yet to reveal themselves. But for now, in this moment, he had made his choice. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like it was the right one. The days after Ethan's confrontation with Lily were a blur of emotions, a tangled web of hope, fear, and uncertainty. He had chosen to stay, to try and rebuild the trust that had been shattered, but it was a fragile piece, one that could break with a single misstep. They were walking on a knife's edge, both of them aware that this was their second chance, and perhaps their last. Ethan spent hours replaying everything in his mind. The revelations about his father, the years of lies, and now, the looming threat from the shadows that still hovered over his life. But amid the chaos, there was one thing that gave him a sense of clarity: Lily. He had seen the depth of her remorse, the sincerity in her words. She had made mistakes, but so had he. And somewhere, deep down, he knew they were stronger together. But the truth was, trust didn't come back easily. Even as he and Lily fell back into the rhythms of their life together, there were moments when doubt crept in, when Ethan caught himself questioning her every word, every glance. He hated that part of himself, the part that couldn't let go of the past, the part that still expected her to hurt him again. But Lily, patient and understanding, never once faltered. She had promised to prove her love, and she did, every single day. Their conversations grew deeper, more raw, as they opened up old wounds and shared secrets they had kept hidden for so long. For the first time, Ethan told Lily about his father's coldness, the loneliness he had felt growing up, how he had buried himself in work to escape the void his parents had left behind. Lily, in turn, spoke of her own demons, the guilt she carried from a family tragedy that had torn her world apart, and how, in Ethan, she had found the first glimpse of hope she hadn't thought she deserved. It was a slow, painful process, this journey of forgiveness, but it was real. They were rebuilding something fragile yet beautiful, brick by brick, piece by piece. But even as they healed together, the shadows of the past refused to fade. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the danger his mother had warned him about was still out there, lurking just beyond his reach. The powerful people who had controlled his father, who had forced his mother into hiding, they hadn't forgotten. And if they thought Ethan knew something, if they thought he held the key to whatever his father had been working on, they would come for him. It was only a matter of time. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills of Santa Carina, Ethan sat on the porch of Lily's cottage, staring out at the horizon. Lily joined him, her presence quiet but grounding, as always. She handed him a glass of wine, and they sat in companionable silence for a while, the tension between them easing with the setting sun. "Do you think it's really over?" Lily asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan shook his head, his gaze still fixed on the distant hills. "No," he said quietly. "I don't think it ever will be. Not until we face them." Lily didn't need to ask who he meant. She had been there when Ethan's mother had warned him about the people who had torn their family apart. The same people who had kept his mother in hiding for all these years. The threat was real, and it was growing. "I can't keep running," Ethan continued, his voice steady but firm. "And I can't hide behind my mother's choices anymore. She was trying to protect me, but I need to protect us. I need to find out what my father was involved in. Whatever he was working on, whatever he left behind. It's the reason they're still watching." Lily looked at him, her eyes filled with a quiet resolve. "Then we'll do it together," she said. "We'll find the truth." Ethan turned to her, his heart swelling with gratitude and love. He wasn't alone in this, not anymore. For so long, he had shouldered the weight of his family's secrets by himself, but now he had someone by his side, someone who was willing to fight for him, for them. That night, Ethan called his mother. The conversation was brief, but it was enough. She confirmed what he had already suspected. There were still people out there, powerful people, who believed that Ethan had inherited something from his father, something that could expose them. His mother didn't know exactly what it was, but she had a lead, an old associate of his father's who had gone underground after his death. If anyone knew the truth, it was him. The next morning, Ethan and Lily packed their bags. They were leaving Santa Carina, leaving behind the quiet, coastal town that had been both a sanctuary and a prison. There was no time for goodbyes, no room for sentimentality. They had a mission now, a purpose. They would find the truth, and they would confront whatever came next, together. The journey led them to a small, unremarkable town in the heart of the desert. It was the kind of place where people went to disappear, where the heat and dust swallowed up the past and left nothing behind. It was here that Ethan's father's associate had been hiding for years, a man named Simon Holt. When they arrived at the rundown motel where Holt was rumored to be staying, Ethan's heart pounded with anticipation. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for, the moment that could unlock everything. Lily stood beside him, her hand slipping into his, a silent reminder that no matter what happened next, they were in this together. Ethan knocked on the door, his breath catching in his throat. There was a long pause before it creaked open, revealing an older man with sharp eyes and a wary expression. He looked Ethan up and down, his gaze lingering on Lily before he finally spoke. "You're Robert Wright's boy, aren't you?" he said, his voice rough and tired. Ethan nodded, his throat tight. "I am. I need to know what my father was working on. I need to know why they're still coming after me." Simon Holt stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter. The room was dimly lit, cluttered with old papers and maps, the air thick with dust. As Ethan and Lily stepped inside, Holt closed the door behind them, locking it with a firm click. "I was wondering when you'd come," Holt said, moving to a chair and sinking into it with a sigh. "Your father, he wasn't just a tech genius. What he created, it was dangerous, powerful, and there are people out there who will stop at nothing to get their hands on it." Ethan's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to stay calm. "What was it?" he asked, his voice steady. Holt looked at him for a long moment, then leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Your father built something, an algorithm, a system, that could change everything. It wasn't just about technology. It was about control. Whoever holds it, holds the power to reshape entire industries, governments, lives." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. His father had built something that could change the world, and now it was up to Ethan to figure out what to do with it. Ethan's mind raced as Simon Holt's words settled over him like a heavy fog. His father's creation wasn't just a piece of technology, it was a weapon. A system that could manipulate economies, control information, and bend the will of entire governments. And now, the people who had driven his mother into hiding were hunting for it. For him, they believed he had the key. Ethan stood in the dim motel room, the weight of his father's legacy pressing down on him. Beside him, Lily was silent, her hand gripping his tightly. He could feel the tremor in her fingers, the same uncertainty that twisted in his own gut. Simon Holt leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes never leaving Ethan's face. "Your father tried to destroy it before they could get their hands on it," Simon continued, his voice gravelly with age. "But I don't think he succeeded. It's still out there, hidden away in places only he would know. And now they think you have access to it." Ethan felt his heart hammering against his ribs. "But I don't," he said, his voice low. "I don't know anything about this. I didn't even know my father was involved in something like this until a few days ago." Holt gave a grim nod. "That doesn't matter to them. They'll come for you anyway. If they think you have even a piece of what your father created, they won't stop." Ethan's mind was spinning, trying to grasp the enormity of it all. His father had built a system that could reshape the world, and now it was his responsibility to deal with the fallout. The danger was real, and it was coming for him. For Lily. For his mother. "So what do we do?" Lily asked softly, her voice breaking the tense silence. Her eyes were wide, but there was a steely resolve in them. "We can't just wait for them to come for us." Ethan looked at her, and for a moment, he felt the calm anchor of her presence. She had been through so much already, had stood by him through every revelation, every betrayal, and now she was still here, ready to face whatever came next by his side. Simon sighed, rubbing a hand over his weathered face. "There's only one way to stop them," he said finally. "You have to destroy whatever's left of your father's system. Wipe it out completely, so no one can use it. But finding it, that's the tricky part." Ethan's pulse quickened. Destroy it? The thought sent a cold rush of fear through him. He didn't know where the system was hidden, but even if he found it, was destruction the only answer? Could something so powerful be erased completely? And what if it could be used for something good? Was it really a weapon, or could it be a tool in the right hands? "Do you know where it is?" Ethan asked, his voice tight with tension. Holt's eyes flickered with hesitation. "Your father left clues, bits of information scattered in places only you could access. I think he wanted you to find it, eventually, but he didn't want it falling into the wrong hands. It's buried deep within his company's systems, locked behind layers of security. You'll need to get inside, and once you do, you'll have to make a choice." The words hung in the air like a weight. A choice. Destroy the system. Erase his father's legacy and stop the people chasing him. Or find it, understand it, and maybe use it. Ethan felt the enormity of it pressing down on him. He had spent his life building empires, making decisions that affected thousands of people. But this was different. This wasn't about profit or success. It was about power. Power that could either save the world or destroy it. Lily watched him, her face soft but determined. "Whatever you decide, I'm with you," she whispered. "But you can't let them win, Ethan. You can't let them take control." He looked at her, his heart aching with love and fear. She was right. He couldn't let this fall into the wrong hands. But was he strong enough to make the right choice? The next few days were a blur of planning and strategy. Ethan knew he couldn't do this alone, and he called in favors from the few people he could trust. His team, those who had worked with him for years, were loyal, and they didn't ask too many questions when he told them he needed access to his father's old servers, to parts of the company that hadn't been touched since his father's death. It took time, but eventually they found it. A series of encrypted files buried deep within the architecture of the company's network. It was the digital footprint of his father's system, a series of codes and algorithms that, if activated, could change everything. Ethan stared at the screen, his heart pounding. This was it, the key to everything. Lily stood beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder. "You don't have to do this alone," she said softly. "Whatever you choose, we'll face it together." He nodded, his throat tight. But the truth was, this decision was his. It had always been his. The burden of his father's choices, the weight of the legacy he had left behind. It all rested on Ethan's shoulders now. His finger hovered over the keyboard. One command, and it would all be gone, destroyed forever. No one would ever be able to use it. No one would ever be able to wield that kind of power again. But as his finger trembled, a thought nagged at him. What if this wasn't just a weapon? What if there was something good in it? Something that could be harnessed for the right reasons? His father had built this system, and Ethan knew better than anyone that his father wasn't an evil man. He had made mistakes, but he had also believed in the power of technology to change the world. What if Ethan was about to erase something that could be used to help people? His heart pounded in his chest, the weight of the decision crushing him. He glanced at Lily, who was watching him with quiet intensity. She trusted him. She believed in him. But this choice was his alone. In the end, it came down to one simple truth. The system was too dangerous. Whatever potential it had for good was outweighed by the risk. If the wrong people got their hands on it, the consequences could be catastrophic. And Ethan couldn't let that happen. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes for a moment, and then pressed the final key. The screen blinked, and the system began to erase itself, line by line, code by code, until there was nothing left. The power that had once loomed so large, that had threatened to destroy everything Ethan cared about, was gone. He sat back, his body flooded with relief. It was over. Lily squeezed his hand. Her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and pride. "You did the right thing," she whispered. Ethan nodded, though the weight of what he had just done still hung over him. He had destroyed his father's greatest creation, erased a legacy that could have changed the world. But in doing so, he had protected the future. And for the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. As they left the building, the sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the horizon. The shadows of the past were behind them now. Together, they would face whatever came next. And whatever it was, they would face it as partners. No more lies, no more secrets. Only truth, only love, only the future they would build, together. If you enjoyed this heartwarming story about overcoming challenges and family love, don't forget to like the video, comment on what touched you the most, and subscribe to the channel. Stay tuned for our next exciting story.